again. Somewhere in my Bible here. There we go. All right. All right, Micah. He identifies himself as Micah of Moresheth, and that's a town name, possibly the same as Moresheth Gath. And that was located, about 25 miles west-southwest of Jerusalem. So it's a little bit lower in elevation, but still kind of a hilly country in there. It's a tribe that belonged to, or it's a town that belonged to the tribe of Judah. However, his ministry and his prophecy here was directed both to the northern kingdom, Samaria, and to the southern kingdom of Judah. He was more than likely, I'm getting ahead of myself here. His name possibly means who is like Yahweh. And something else that I'll mention about the town in which he lived, and that's that it was very close to Philistine territory. And that may have some influence on some of his writing here. And also the ancient town in which he lived has probably been excavated. When did he write this? Around the 8th century BC, probably before 700 BC. Micah himself starts out in verse 1 saying, "The word of the Lord which came to Micah at Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah." Those are all three kings, successive kings of the southern kingdom of Judah, okay? Kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. And Samaria then is a stand-in, it means not only the city, but also it represents the 10 northern tribes, and Jerusalem is we'll call it the capital of Judah, so that represents the southern tribes. The recorded events here in the date of writing, if he was delivering these prophecies during that time, you see the dates of the reign of Jotham there on the notes, 740 to 732. Ahaz, 732 to 716. Just a quick question. What kind of king was, both of these, Jotham and Ahaz? What do you remember about their kingly rule? Speak up. Yeah, but basically they're evil, okay? Both of them bring in idolatry, okay? And Ahaz, remember Ahaz has a very famous wife. Anybody remember? Jezebel, okay? All right, and she introduces, I shouldn't use the term introduces, but she brings in Baal worship into the southern kingdom as well. More than likely, Micah is a contemporary with Isaiah and probably Hosea as well. So the date of the recorded events within here, when did he write this? And when did he deliver these prophecies? Probably sometime between about 735 and 710 BC. That would mean then that the destruction of Samaria, the 10 northern tribes, by Assyria, which occurred in 722 BC, then that took place sometime during Micah's prophetic writings here. He mentions Samaria and impending judgment for the 10 northern tribes in chapter 1. So that part we have to assume he probably wrote before that, okay? The literary form of this book is delivered as prophetic oracles or sermons. There's really about 3 different sermons within here. But all of that is couched within poetic form, which is kind of interesting. So it's all in the entire book is within Hebrew poetic form, which also has a bearing on how you interpret the book, okay? Because Hebrew poetry follows certain patterns, and we use those patterns to help us interpret. Also, the purpose or theme of the book, seems to be that of coming judgment for Israel, the northern kingdom, Samaria, and Judah for their sins, followed by promise of restoration. They'll have their day in court, but it seems like another point of these prophecies is that Judah is no less guilty than Samaria. Okay, so the time for judgment upon the southern kingdom is coming as well. I looked up words that occur frequently in this book, and the word Lord, Lords, or God occurs 75 times. So that ought to tell you kind of what the emphasis of the book is. You also hear the words or read the words destruction, destroy, or destroyed. They occur 28 times in the book. The word judgment is used 9 times. The words people or peoples and nation are used 60 times. All of that, just looking at that analysis, I think gives you an idea of the focus of the prophecies here. And I said that the organization of the book is apparently organized around 3 basic prophetic messages. Some of you may even have Bibles that will identify that. We're not going to focus so much on that structure, but we are going to spend more time looking at key passages and verses within here. I'm going to skip over that for now. The evidence for inspiration of the book, well, number 1, the word Lord or Lords or God is used 75 times, and Micah starts out in the very first verse saying, the word of the Lord which came to Micah, which came to. In other words, he didn't go out scratching for it. He didn't discover it. It came to him. We know nothing else really about Micah. Who was he? All we know was that the Lord came to him, gave these messages to him, and he delivered them faithfully. That becomes, I think, the evidence for the internal evidence for the inspiration here. The audience, we've already mentioned this, who was supposed to hear this, both the northern and the southern kingdoms, Israel, Judah, represented sometimes by the use of the term Jacob as well. We're going to see that some about the plan of redemption is being revealed in this book. We see about Christ or the Messiah, including his birthplace, his lineage, his origin, his reign, and his kingship are all mentioned within this book. So this is actually a very messianic book. And there's quite a few passages that we cite today that come out of this book. Now, here's an interesting backstory. If you flip over to Jeremiah 26:18. I'm going to start reading at the beginning of that chapter just to help set a little bit of context here. So we're in the book of Jeremiah the prophet, okay? In verse 1, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came from the Lord to Jeremiah, saying, thus says the Lord, stand in the court of the Lord's house and speak to all the cities of Judah who have come to worship in the Lord's house all the words that I have commanded you to speak to them. Don't omit a word. Perhaps they'll listen, and everyone will turn from his evil way, that I may repent of the calamity which I am planning to do to them because of the evil of their deeds. All right? So does that sound like a happy little message that Jeremiah is getting ready to deliver? No. Okay, he's warning them of judgment for their sins. Right, so if you skip down, let's pick it up. Verse 13. Now therefore amend your ways and your deeds and obey the voice of the Lord your God, and the Lord will change his mind about the misfortune which he has pronounced against you. But as for me, behold, I am in your hands. Do with me as is good and right in your sight. Only know for certain that if you put me to death, you will bring innocent blood on yourselves and on this city and on its inhabitants. For truly the Lord has sent me to you to speak all these words in your hearing." Then the officials and all the people said to the priests and to the prophets, "No, death sentence for this man, for he has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God." In other words, the people don't like what Jeremiah is saying, okay? So if we move this up a few centuries, what would they be crying out? Crucify him, okay? Then some of the elders of the land arose up and spoke to all the assembly of the people, saying, "Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and he spoke to all the people of Judah, saying, Thus the Lord of hosts has said, Zion will be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem will become ruins, and the mountains of the house as the high places of a forest." Did Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all Judah put Micah to death? Okay. Did he not fear the Lord and entreat the favor of the Lord? And the Lord changed his mind about the misfortune which he had pronounced against him. But we are committing a great evil against ourselves. So in other words, the point is that some of the elders have the biblical wisdom and understanding to see that what Jeremiah is saying is truly from the Lord. And so they're referring back to Micah and his prophecy, saying, Micah prophesied the same kind of stuff that Jeremiah did, and under Hezekiah, they did not kill him. So why should we kill Jeremiah? You see that? Well, and overall, I just wanted you to see that Micah here is referred to in another prophetic book, right? And this kind of helps establish, I think, the authenticity of his prophecy and of his character. Any comments, questions? George?
Yeah, verse 16, my infallible version of the Bible here says, "This man does not deserve the sentence of death."
Are you still in Jeremiah? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, and that's the elders.
So they wouldn't have been saying crucify him a few centuries later.
No. The people, okay, are saying they want Jeremiah dead. The elders come along and they look at the situation and they're arguing against the people, saying, no, we shouldn't do that.
This says the officials and all the people said to the priests and the prophets, "This man is not."
Okay, then they reach a unanimous conclusion. Okay, so the testimony of the elders, and referring back to Micah, I think, convinces the people they shouldn't kill Jeremiah, and so they come to an agreement on that.
That occurs later.
Yeah, as you follow chronologically through this. Okay? All right, anything else? Okay. All right, back into Micah then. I give you kind of a rough outline, and we'll come back to that. I want to talk about the sins that are condemned within the book. So that's on the back of the sheet of paper there. And so I've listed out all of these sins. So in chapter 1, Samaria is condemned for their false worship that leads to idolatry, having divided the once unified nation, for temple prostitution. Jerusalem is condemned for the allowance of pagan places of idolatry even being brought into the city. Chapter 2, verse 1, wealthy landowners exploiting the poor, coveting, arrogance, defrauding, wanton disregard for the rights of fellow countrymen. We're going to come back and talk more about that in a minute. Also, chapter 2, false prophets who are exploiting the people for gain, perverting God's truth. In chapter 3, the leaders, the rulers, perhaps including the priests and prophets, hating what is good and loving what is evil. In other words, perverse standards, committing injustice as a result of that. And you could also see more in verses 9 and 10 and more of that theme comes out in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3, and also in chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Then we have false prophets prophesying for gain, telling the people what they want to hear. Remember itching ears that Paul talks about over in Timothy. There's bloodshed for gain, wickedness, chapter 3, verse 10. Verse 11, leaders pass judgment for a bribe. Priests instruct for a price. Prophets tell fortunes for money, which perverts the role of a prophet. And by all, there's presumption upon the Lord. Presumption in the sense of since basically the wealthy or aristocratic classes are prospering during this time, there's a false assumption that God must be approving of our lifestyle. And the proof of that is he's blessing us with wealth. Okay? So that's a presumption upon the Lord. And at the same time, they abhor Micah's warnings. Chapter 4, verse 11, other nations gloating over the calamities in Israel due to God's judgments. So it's not just Samaria and Judah that are being warned here, but other nations that surround the nation of Israel. In chapter 5, 10 through 15, trust in walled cities and fortresses instead of the Lord. They're warned about that all the way back in Deuteronomy 17:16. You should look that up if you have a chance. Witchcraft is condemned, which is associated with sorceries or occultism, which is moving that more into our time, seeking information from demonic sources. Idolatry, false worship, again condemned. The Asherah places, which involves more idolatry. False measures and weights being used. The wealthy are violent, liars, and deceitful. And the following of the idolatrous practices of Omri and Ahab, which were really instituted by Jeroboam. Okay, Paul, is that enough list? Okay. All right, Paul.
As you read that, I just thought to myself, there's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, I need to give you a little background here. And we don't have time to read the entire chapter, but this comes out of Leviticus chapter 25. And I think this will help you understand what the wealthy were doing. Okay? And then maybe that will help us understand, maybe there's some ways that we can find application from this. All right? All right, so Leviticus chapter 25, under the law there, establishes two things for the nation, two very important things. The first one is that every seventh year, what were they supposed to do? They were supposed to give the land a rest. They were not supposed to plant crops, okay? And in the sixth year, God would bless them with a double portion, so to speak, of their crop production. Actually, it's more than a double, because if you think about it, if they don't plant anything the seventh year, then they got to wait until the eighth year and they can start planting, and it's not near until the end of the eighth year that they start harvesting, okay? So in that sixth year, they have to have some really good crop production in order to get through that seventh. Now, that Sabbath year, supposed to be observed every 7 years, becomes part of the basis, part of God's basis for how many years they spend in captivity. How long does Judah go into captivity? 70 years. That's based on 70 times that the nation failed to observe the seventh year Sabbath. And Jeremiah is the one who tells them that. And then Daniel, reading Jeremiah from that, is able to come to a conclusion about how much longer are we going to stay in captivity here in Babylon. So that's all rather interesting. Okay. Focus of this book, though, is more really on a second thing in Leviticus 25, and that's the year of Jubilee. Right? Anybody remember anything about the year of Jubilee? What's supposed to happen then? Freedom. I keep hearing several people saying, give everything back. Okay? All right, so what does Leviticus tell us? Well, number one, when they come into the land from God's perspective doesn't belong to the people. The people of Israel are basically renters and caretakers of God's land. All right? And since God is the owner and they're just caretakers or renters, God has the authority to do what? He can evict them from the land. All right? Now, when that land, when they came into the land, if you get over into the book of Joshua, one of the things you would find in reading like the last half of the book of Joshua is that once they conquered most of that territory that they were supposed to take, then they started dividing that territory up. And they divided it up by the tribes, but within each of the tribes, they divided it by families. All right? So that each family then had a permanent possession of land. And so, with that in mind, okay, let's remember this is all an agrarian culture, all right? You're a farmer. Put yourself in a farmer's place here, all right? In an agrarian culture like that, you grow crops to sustain yourself and your family, all right? Those of you who have been in that situation or have some knowledge about it, what all can go wrong? Come on, give me a list. What all can go wrong? Peggy? Weather. So be more specific. There could be too much rain. There could be too little rain. There could be hail. Is that what you said? Yeah, hailstorms. Freezing. What? Something about grass? Oh, plagues. Okay. Yeah, different plagues of insects. There could also be diseases. Right? Lots of things could go wrong. So let's say you're one of those families that incurred that kind of misfortune. Well, where are you going to get your food? What do? You get it from somebody else, but how did they get it back then? You either got to trade something, which could be their land, all right, or themselves, all right. They would trade themselves sometimes as what we might refer to as an indentured servant, right? Now, let's say that occurred, let's say you just had the year of Jubilee, so we're in year 1 after that, okay? And you had this misfortune, all right? So you're going to maybe indenture yourself for how long? 49 years. Huh? What'd you say?
I thought if you were a Jew, every 7 years you were released from that captivity, where you rented your land for 70 years, though, for 69 years.
I think, go back and reread Leviticus 25, okay? Whatever the case was, in either case, all right, you were supposed to prorate that time of service, right? Okay? In other words, and let's talk about a piece of land, all right? If you were going to have to rent out your land or loan your land to somebody else in order to try to get food for yourself, and let's say you're in the 49th year, then that's a lot of rent, so to speak, okay? But if it was, say, like the 48th year or 49th year, yeah, you couldn't rent it for much, all right? So all of that's just to point out it was all supposed to be prorated. But when you hit the 50th year, what? It all goes back to the original owner. Now, to the family. Yes, to the family, all right? So this was God's way of protecting the families, all right? He gave them permanent possession. But one thing here, and I'll let you go ahead and speak in just a sec. And this applied to actual land, and it applied to people who owned houses in unwalled cities. if you go back and read Leviticus 25, okay? All right, if you owned a house in a walled city and you needed to sell that, then whoever you sold it to became the new permanent owner. That's all right. So there's another little caveat there. All right. So I'm belaboring a lot of stuff here to try to get across a point. This is how the wealthy in Israel were. They were abusing this whole setup. Okay. By not, as far as we know, we only have, I think, in the Old Testament, 2 possible references to the year of Jubilee even being observed. Okay? And so since it probably was not being observed, that made it possible, more than possible, for those who were less fortunate, okay, more poverty-stricken or whatever, to lose that land and lose it on a permanent basis. And the wealthy were adept at using the elders who sat as judges, who would take bribes, okay, in order to acquire those lands, those properties on a permanent basis. All right, Ed, did you have any? Nothing else?
I was going to say, was there any evidence that they ever did the year of Jubilee?
Yeah.
You answered that.
Okay, all right. So do you see the potential here?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So there's all kinds of potential for abuse. And this was very specifically one of the things that Micah was condemning, because it was a process of taking those less fortunate, those with less assets and resources, and just driving them deeper and deeper into poverty, and the wealthy were prospering from that and gaining more and more in wealth. Right? Okay. But they were doing that. The reason why it was working out that way is because they were violating the law that God gave them, right? Not because of some principles of socialism or capitalism here, but that God was the owner of that land. And under Joshua, it was apportioned out to the tribes and to the families. Right? Does that help clear a few things up? I hope.
Did you say that there's only proof that most of the people really adhered to this the year of Jubilee?
In looking through the Old Testament, we can only find a couple of references to the year of Jubilee. In other words, since there's so few references to it, the assumption seems to be they very soon got away from observing this. Okay? Jake, did you find anything?
Well, just the fact that they're getting punished for 70 years for not obeying it would be an indication.
Well, they were being punished for 70 years for not obeying the 7-year Sabbath.
7 year, not the 7.
Yeah, you got to keep the 7-year Sabbath separate from the 50-year Jubilee.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
So Jubilee is basically, you have a Sabbath year, and then you have the Jubilee year.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it could work out then, or should work out, so that the Sabbath year would be the 49th year, and the year of Jubilee would be the
they
50th.
didn't do any of that. They basically turned the church into a business, and therefore, because the business, they're taking bribes, letting it, okay, let's wheel and deal this, you keep that, you know.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, turning the body of the church, the people, into prostitutes, because they were just doing the will of someone else, you know, for money.
Okay?
And through all of that, and it's just, it really, if you think about it for a while, it's really grievous that they never did that, and we never do that today, you know. That would have been so wonderful if that happened.
Okay, I'm not sure where you're seeing, what application you're trying to make here. That's,
No application at all.
okay, all right. I mean, you know, this law was not intended for, God never imposed this on any other nation that I know of. Okay? All right. The people of Israel, they're the one nation chosen by God to be in a covenant relationship with Him. And so this law was for them as a nation. All right. Let's see. So you've seen the list of sins and everything. Let's look at some of these passages then. Let's start with the key passages or verses. Chapter 4, verse 3. I'm sure you're going to recognize some of these. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty, distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. Where do we find that today? In our own country?
At the UN.
Yeah.
Flag
Yeah, that's at the UN. Yeah, okay.
with no context.
With no context, yeah. Okay. Chapter 5, verse 2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. This one will be our peace. Okay, and I'm going to stop there. What do you know about that prophecy there? Where do we see that in the New Testament? Yeah, this applies to Jesus. This is a messianic passage, okay? What do you remember more specifically about? Remember when the wise men and Herod, okay, and Herod does some inquiry, and what does he find out from the Jewish leaders? Where's Messiah? Where's this king supposed to be born? Bethlehem, and they quote this passage. Yeah, okay. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 8.
Tim,
Yes, Terry.
just thinking, there's also one of the strongest arguments for the deity of the Messiah, in whose origins are old.
From eternity. Yeah. So Terry's pointing out that that's a very strong passage and evidence for the eternal deity of Christ there. All right, chapter 6, verses, what I put here, 6 through 8, okay? With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in the thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Well, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. Yeah, now put that back in that context of those wealthy who are totally abusing the poor, the less fortunate, seizing their lands, bribing judges to make cases against them so that they can grab those lands and remove them permanently from those families. Love justice. Okay? And then chapter 7, verse 18. Who is a God like you, who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious act of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in unchanging love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Yes, you will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You will give truth to Jacob and unchanging love to Abraham, which you swore to our forefathers from the days of old. All right. Beautiful ending to the book here, and it follows a pattern. In the pattern of the book, if we go back into chapter 1, look at verse 2 there. Remember, this is God speaking through the prophet Micah. Hear, O peoples, all of you. Listen, O earth, and all it contains. And let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. Right? So the prophecy that's going to be delivered against both kingdoms of Israel here starts out with God basically saying, calling the entire earth to witness against those two kingdoms. All right? And then that's at the towards the end of the book. Let's see if I can remember the passage now. Can't remember if it's chapter 6 or 7. But again, God calls upon he calls them into court. It's like God calling Israel and the 10 northern tribes, the 2 southern tribes. He's calling them before him to present their case. Okay.
6, 2, and 3.
Okay, 6, 2, and 3. Thank you. Hear now what the Lord is saying. Arise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, because the Lord has a case against his people. Even with Israel, he will dispute. Right? So the book has kind of this legal format to it. This is what I'm saying here. All right. The other passages there, you can kind of look up yourself. The first 2 chapters then primarily consist of this indictment against both the northern and the southern kingdom. All right. So you don't get to the promises of future blessing until we start getting over into chapter 3. So as you look through my outline kind of summary, you have an alert given there in verse 2. The promise of the Lord himself coming in judgment, verses 3 through 5. That judgment is described in more detail. And then you have a response of the peoples in various cities. But it's a response not of innocence, but of woe, of mourning for what's being pointed out here. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, there is a woe pronounced against the evil plotters of some of the sins that we've seen listed here. And the Lord has a plan for disaster or calamity because of this in verses 2 through 5. And then in verses 6 through 7, false prophecies being condemned. These are the prophets who are basically saying, who are telling the people what they want to hear. Okay? The Lord's not going to do these things. We are his people. He won't do that to us. But Micah assures us by God's word here that God will discipline his children. And then verses 8 through 11, there's more accusations and condemnation. But then chapter 2, verse 12, 12 through 13, I think. No, I'm in the wrong chapter here. Okay. There we go. 12 through 13. I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep in the fold, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with men. The breaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord at their head. This looks at a future time of restoration for the nation. Chapter 3, the leaders of Israel are condemned. And I said, this is Micah speaking, hear now, heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear off their skin from them and their flesh from their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, strip off their skin from them, break their bones, and chop them up as for the pot. What does that sound like to you? Well, yeah. I think this is intended to be poetic exaggeration. But yeah, it's the wealthy here taking advantage of the poor and treating them as though they were animals that had been hunted down and slain and skinned, okay? And the bones broken up so they can put it in a stew pot, all right? Very graphic, all right? Paul, did you have a comment? Yeah, that's what somebody else had said here. Yeah, it reflects cannibalism. So the leaders are condemned. Verse 5 through 7, false prophets condemned again. Verses 8 through 12, Micah speaking for the Lord, just judgment is going to come for all of this injustice and bloodshed. In chapter 4, 1 through 4, here we have another one of those times of blessing that will follow all of this. Once the Lord disciplines his nation, verse 1, and it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come up and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. And then they will hammer their swords," and we already read that part there, okay? And that all, if you sat in on our class in the book of Revelation, that all we believe applies to that millennial period, that 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. All right. Chapter 5, I'm skipping to there, the promised Messiah from out of Bethlehem, which we just read a little bit earlier. The scattered remnant of Jacob to be strengthened again in verses 7 through 9. But there has to be a purging that occurs, and that's verses 10 through 15. And then in chapter 6, God's message of denunciation again against Israel. You have Israel's response in verses 6 through 8. And take a quick look at Deuteronomy 10, 12 through 18. Deuteronomy 10, 12 through 18. So this is going back centuries. And this, it seems like Micah basically echoes this. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and love him, and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Right? And then there is a verse, okay, we'll keep going here. Verse 18, he executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. And if you were to spend more time reading in the Mosaic law or in the Torah, okay, you would see these principles hammered out and applied for the nation. All right. Chapter 6, the use of false measures and weights are being condemned in verses 10 and 11. In verse 12, the wealthy are described as being not violent, but violent, okay? Typo there. Liars and deceitful. And again, following the idolatrous practices of Omri and Ahab, instituted by Jeroboam. Jeroboam is the one who set up the northern kingdom. And at the southern end of that kingdom, these are the 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes. And towards the southern geographic end of those 10 tribes and up toward the north geographic end, he set up something. Anybody remember?
Idol or a worship.
2 golden calves. Okay? What does that remind you of? All the way back when they're coming out of Egypt, doesn't it? And they make the golden calf then, right?
But they only made one, that's why it didn't work.
Yeah, okay, they only made one. That's why it didn't work. All right. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea, the overview of the book. You got a section there. I was running out of space. Applications. What can you identify out of this book as application for yourself personally? It's probably easy to sit there and say to yourself, okay, I'm not robbing anybody of their land. All right? At least, maybe, I hope you're not, okay? Paul?
Well, I thought throughout your class, beware of every form of greed, for therein lies destruction.
Okay, beware of every form of greed, for therein lies destruction. Yeah. Okay. So that opens the door to a lot of other ways to examine our lives, doesn't it? All right. Or in some way, are we being ruled by greed? Is wealth, okay, something that we covet? Terry, you have a suggestion?
Micah 3:11 really speaks to me because it talks about what the judges and the priests are doing. And it says, yet they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us?
Yeah. Okay. And so that message of condemnation against presumption, presuming upon the Lord. We're still, you can point out any number of ills about our nation and our country and everything. We are still just incredibly wealthy, right? I'm just amazed to think about the wealth that we have in this country. I would dare say that all of us sitting here right now are more wealthy than 98% of the 8 billion people that live on this earth at this time, right? We are in grave danger of presuming upon that, right? This is not to condemn wealth, right? I don't offer this as a condemnation for it, but I offer this as a reminder that what Micah offers here, and that is to walk humbly before our God. Okay, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for allowing us time to look at this. We thank you for the words of that you've given the prophet Micah, and we ask, Lord, that you not only help us understand these in the historical context, but we also understand the application for our time, our lives today. And we ask that you impress this upon us in Jesus' name. Amen.